listener production.
Hey, Tara Cassidy with you, and welcome to The Briefing. If I asked you to name Australia's worst terrorist, could you?
The Christchurch terrorist, through his live stream, through his propaganda, through his manifesto, set up for this attack to be something that would be inspirational. You know, not completely unlike when Al-Qaeda flew planes into the World Trade Center on 9/11. This was terrorism as theatre.
Why an investigative journalist is digging into the Christchurch terror attack 6 years on, and why we can't believe everything we've been told about him is coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Chris Spyrou. It's Monday the 30th of June.
Hey Tara, and to you listening, the Greens candidate who ran against Anthony Albanese in his seat at the recent federal election says she could be left blind in one eye after being injured by police whilst being arrested at a pro-Palestine protest.
I'm 5'1", I weigh about 45 kilos. I was engaged in peaceful protests, and my interactions with New South Wales police have left me potentially without vision in my right eye permanently.
35-year-old Hannah Thomas was arrested and is among 5 people who have now been charged after police clashed with protesters in Sydney's southwest on Friday. The protest took place outside a manufacturing site alleged by protesters to supply parts to make a fighter jet used by the IDF, allegations the company denies.
The former Greens candidate, who's since had surgery on her eye, can be seen in footage from Friday being dragged away by a group of officers before falling to the ground and later spotted with blood pouring from her eye. Taking to socials last night, she also called out the state's recently introduced anti-protest laws, directly calling out the New South Wales Premier and Police Minister.
I look like this now because of Chris Minns and Yasmin Catley and their draconian anti-protest laws and their attempts to demonise protesters, especially protesters for Palestine. They've emboldened the police to crack down with extreme violence and brutality, and they were warned that those laws would lead to this outcome.
Now, New South Wales Police say it's continuing to investigate the matter and are seeking further information, but maintaining the protest was unauthorised and was blocking access to a business.
Thomas is scheduled to appear at Bankstown Local Court in August, accused of hindering or resisting a police officer and refusing to comply with a direction. Now, Tara, these laws that she's referencing are those anti-protest laws that have kind of been in the spotlight in New South Wales at the moment. They're being looked into in a parliamentary inquiry because it came on the back end of a caravan terrorist plot that was sold to the people of New South Wales and Australia as being a potentially mass casualty event. Police have come out after the fact to say that that's not the case, and now the upper house of Parliament is accusing the Minns government of misleading them into rushing through these laws. Importantly, though, New South Wales Police have not commented on whether these powers given under these new laws were the ones used on Friday to move protesters on.
Fellow surfers and onlookers are being applauded for their actions after a 16-year-old boy was mauled by a shark at a beach on the New South Wales north coast. Emergency crews were called to Cabarita Beach, about 20 minutes from the Queensland-New South Wales border, after the surfer was attacked while swimming late Sunday afternoon. A video on social media shows the boy being carried up to the beach by a group of surfers and beachgoers after he was bitten on his right leg, right arm and wrist.
New South Wales ambulances Ben Mumford told Nine the group helped tourniquet the teen's arm to stop the bleeding.
We believe he was swimming at the time. There was a few brave people in the water that helped him out of the water, and there was also a couple of off-duty paramedics on scene that assisted him till we arrived.
The teenager was taken to a hospital on the Gold Coast where he remains in a serious but stable condition. Cabarita Beach will remain closed until at least late this afternoon, with the chance of that being extended to reduce the risk of a second attack. For the first time from tomorrow, thousands of Uni and TAFE students are set to be paid for their mandatory practical placements. Teaching, nursing, midwifery and social work students will be paid $331.65 a week for placements from July 1, equivalent to about $60 a day or $8 an hour.
Ooh, cha-ching.
It's estimated around 68,000 uni students and 5,000 TAFE students will be able to access the payments each year. But to be able to access it, they have to prove they're not earning more than $1,500 a week and have to have worked more than 15 hours in a job outside of uni first. International students aren't eligible.
Yeah, and now while this is obviously a win and being applauded by students and advocates who have been pushing for this for years, there's a few things that are copying some criticism about it. The first being the very low pay, $8 an hour. That is a third of minimum wage. Separately, the fact that it's only being offered to students in these particular faculties and not all uni and TAFE students who do free work via prac or internships. And look, I can get around this. I did 8 unpaid internships during my journalism degree to try and get noticed in the workforce. And look, there are other faculties like med students who have to do 2,000 hours of prac. So I can understand this. I think people should get paid if they have to do these hours.
Yeah, and I mean, a similar thing as you, but mine was in the world of law and doing all those crazy, crazy hours for free and doing all that work. So we're talking affidavits, drafting court documents. And then on top of it, I had to do the sucky thing of sending the clients the invoices and not a single cent of that was coming my way. So yes, I support this, I endorse this. And while it is important that people get their start and work from the ground up, fair compensation is definitely something we should be striving for. Look, we want to get your thoughts on this. Be sure to reach out to us on our broadcast channel at The Briefing Podcast on Instagram. We will pop a prompt and make sure you interact with that.
Strap yourselves in, Aussies. Right across the country, we are in for a wild week of weather. The Bureau of Meteorology says there's a powerful storm that's brewing off the Queensland coast right now, and that's set to move south, which could, quote, get pretty nasty.
A powerful low-pressure system will drench and batter parts of New South Wales and Victoria in the coming week. On Wednesday, this low-pressure area intensifies, becomes larger, stronger, more powerful, and that is going to be our significant weather system for the middle of this week.
That will mean gale force winds and torrential rain for parts of Sydney and the Illawarra South Coast, with some areas likely to see large rain totals and possible riverine and flash flooding, Chris.
Yeah, forecasters say some isolated areas may see as much as 200 millimetres or more of rain in the next 48 hours, with coastal areas from Coffs Harbour to Bega currently being warned about potential flash flooding, coastal erosion and storm damage, while winds could be stronger than 100 kilometres an hour, even up to 125. Meanwhile, the system will also bring a bit of rain and wind for other parts of the east coast, including Victoria, Tassie and South Australia. It'll likely bring the most severe weather Tuesday and Wednesday before easing off by Thursday. Now, we can't forget our west coast friends, Western Australia. You guys are also set for a drenching, with Perth likely to experience a cold front over the next week and get a possible thunderstorm.
Ah, nostalgia.
Yeah, nostalgia for you. I'm sitting there scratching my head going, what's this song? But hey, are we witnessing the death of the old pub shout? New data's found Aussies are ditching buying their mates a round of drinks as cost of living pressures continue to bite. With a report finding 35% of us are less likely to shout our mates around these days compared to last year. Rather, we're more likely to split the bill or just order solo.
Okay.
As well as cost of living, things like QR code ordering also played a part, with 42% of us saying we'd actually purposefully buy our food and drinks via QR code just to avoid rounds altogether.
Oh, we're all cheapskates, apparently.
Oh, gosh.
No, that data was collected from over 1,000 Aussies and more than 30 million food and drink orders. And funnily, it showed millennials were most likely to avoid buying rounds, but over 30% of Gen Z, Gen X and baby boomers also said that they'd go for QR codes just to avoid taking part in any rounds. And look, it's not just us Aussies that are being cheapskates amid this cost of living crunch. There was a similar report done in the US that found the very same trend. People are bucking the old drink shout as well there. So I don't know. What do you think? I mean, drinks are exy and around at the moment. That could cost over $100 depending on how many friends are with you. So I don't know. I'm all for this.
Yeah, and don't I know it, especially when we go out as a big group and it's like, oh, it's my time to shout. You're like, oh, here it comes. Here comes the 3 bloody figure price tag on that one. Look, I'm for it. I'm for it if you're in a group of friends who reciprocate the shouting. If you're in a group of friends and, you know, we've all been part of those scenarios where 1 or 2 of them just seem to fly under the radar. I hate when we do group shouting, but very interesting.
I also feel guilty. Like, I feel like I have to order a cheap drink. Like, I just want to be able to order what I want. So I like going and ordering my own. You guys buy your own, okay?
Yeah, well, I mean, you and I can be great friends because I love a house red, Tara Cassidy, no more than about $4 to $5 a glass. Hey, that is it for headlines today. Next up is my deep dive, looking into what we didn't know about Australia's worst terrorist with the investigative journalist who spent the last 2 years retracing his steps. That deep dive is coming up for you next.
I have now had the opportunity to be fully briefed with the details of the unprecedented events that took place in Christchurch this afternoon.
Witnesses say at least one gunman opened fire on worshippers at the mosques as they were gathering for Friday prayers.
Authorities charging a man with murder in connection to the deadly mass shooting at 2 mosques in New Zealand.
It is clear that this can now only be described as a terrorist attack.
You think you know the story of Australia's worst terrorist who, in March 2019, opened fire on 2 mosques in Christchurch, killing 51 worshippers, the youngest among them a 3-year-old boy. He live-streamed it, was arrested, and became the first person convicted of terrorism in New Zealand. He's now serving life behind bars with no parole. For years, we've been told he acted alone, and Australia's never asked questions about what led him to violence. But that's not the whole truth. Joey Watson is an investigative journalist with Listener who's retraced the terrorist's footsteps around the globe in his latest season of Secrets We Keep Lone Actor. And he joins me now. Joey, welcome back to The Briefing. Who is the Christchurch terrorist?
Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch terrorist, is a guy who grew up in Grafton in the north of New South Wales, who went on to commit the worst terrorist attack ever carried out by an Australian in New Zealand in 2019 at 28 years of age. He's someone who, over the last 2.5 years, I've become quite obsessed with, in that I've tried to understand his trajectory towards violence, how he went from this kid in Grafton who lived a seemingly normal life from the outside, who ended up carrying out something so unbelievably horrible.
Throughout the podcast, there's a moment, especially in episode 1, where you kind of, well, I feel you're labouring over the decision to name him by name or call him the terrorist. Can you explain to us why or what your thinking behind that was?
So the podcast was really born out of a lot of questions from the victim community, researchers, sources that I knew in intelligence agencies, etc., that after the attack, we didn't have the full story about what or who had led him to violence. I saw how in Australia, this event had kind of just faded away from public view. For a moment, in the days and months after the attack, it was a really, really big deal. It woke us all up to the threat that far-right extremism posed in a part of the world that we never would have expected it to have happened. But soon it sort of evaporated. But there were people that didn't forget. We came to decide that kind of sparingly using his name every now and then was appropriate, and that doing it without it and just kind of giving him this some other designation like the individual or something like that would kind of, in this context, have a kind of Voldemort effect where it would give it more weight than it needed to have.
Well, it's interesting for me because I have a neighbour who was in New Zealand at the time of these attacks, and we were talking about your podcast and we were talking about his name and why that name isn't quite well known. And he had mentioned that at the time in New Zealand, it was almost like forbidden. The Prime Minister at the time, Jacinda Ardern, she actively encouraged people not to speak his name so as not to make it this, wildfire moment of notoriety and fame.
He sought many things from his act of terror, but one was notoriety. And that is why you will never hear me mention his name.
in many ways, there's no script for what to do after an event like this. I mean, we've never actually experienced right-wing terrorism on anywhere near this scale in Australia. I mean, there has been individual acts of right-wing violence, and there have been terrorism cases. I'm thinking, of course, there was fire bombings in Perth in the 90s, but there's no script for how to deal with this afterwards. And I think New Zealand sort of responded with this collective trauma. You know, he will not be named, and that is completely understandable. And I don't blame anyone who wanted to have that approach. But I think the unintended consequence of that was it was sort of putting him out of sight and out of mind. And a lot of the story in terms of how he'd got into violence had sort of fallen out of public view, and we'd lost sight of a lot of that as well. And that's why 6 years on, with the blessing of the victim community, I wanted to go back through and sort of work out what we'd missed.
Well, without spoiling the entire podcast, what did you discover about how he was radicalized? I understand a lot of it was online, but there were a bunch of real-world triggers as well. What can you tell us about those?
I realized very early on, I set up a radicalization window for him, where using posts from the internet, I work out that he was radicalized sometime around the middle of 2014. So I wanted to work out kind of what was going on in that period to turn this guy from someone who was planning to travel for the rest of his life to someone who was planning, or at least thinking about, an act of extreme right-wing terrorism. And to do that, I explored the ecosystems that I had found him operating in the years before the attack. And as you say, some of them are online. So particularly important were image board websites like 8chan and 4chan, where there was posts and engagements he'd had with Australian extremist groups that had seen a growth in the years before the attack. But then he'd also spent a lot of time traveling in the years leading up, and particularly important were these two suspicious trips that he'd taken to southeastern Europe in the years leading up to the attack. The first one in 2016, where he'd taken his first step in his mobilization towards violence by emailing a gun club in New Zealand. This is before he'd moved to New Zealand. And then the second one was a trip to Bulgaria and Romania that he'd taken just a couple of months before the attack. So they became particularly important for the investigation.
Well, you actually went to the big lengths of traveling to those areas in Europe. Did you ever fear for your life? Because I'll let you know that we here at the Listener Office, we weren't too sure if you were going to make it back.
I don't think so. I had some very interesting experiences kind of following leads and engaging with Nazi groups and far-right extremists in those parts of the world. I did 4 days of golf lessons with a Serbian war criminal, for example, a convicted Serbian war criminal who had a wolf, which I thought was a dog. I went to pat it and he told me not to pat it because it was actually a wolf. And that was definitely anxiety-inducing. But I did have a really interesting moment of tension where I did get asked by a neo-Nazi who had links to Tarrant in the years before the attack. He'd actually gamed with him whether or not I was Jewish. That was sort of quite a confronting thing to answer. But also generally, I think sort of my connection to the Holocaust, like my grandparents on my mother's side were Holocaust refugees. I've been to the ground in Poland where my great-grandmother was taken from her house and shot. And I think that those experiences give me a sense of direction in that I can understand directly the complete consequences of where this sort of political ideology goes. Christchurch was awful because it happened in the context of a liberal democratic society. But when societies fall to fascism, like what we saw in Nazi Germany, this sort of mass scale murder, this sort of stuff can be normalized. And I am driven by that sense of anxiety that the horrible things that happened in the 20th century could happen again. My hope is by showing how these communities are connected to each other, by exposing them, by showing how this ideology works, that we can understand it more, confront it, and avoid that horrible outcome.
As I was listening to the first half of the series, I was thinking to myself over and over again, and I couldn't get it out of my head, that the Christchurch terror attack was such a massive moment in Australia and across the globe. I do wonder, though, if something like this happened today, do you think it would have such an impact? Because some of the themes that this podcast touches on is very much well and alive at the moment, and we're seeing it unfolding in parts of Europe and across the globe right now actively.
Fortunately, civil society is still intact, and the mass slaughter of civilians in any context is still something that would be extraordinarily devastating and impact us all profoundly. The Christchurch terrorist, through his live stream, through his propaganda, through his manifesto, through the things that he'd done in the lead up to the attack, set up for this attack to be something that would be inspirational. Not completely unlike when Al-Qaeda flew planes into the World Trade Center on 9/11. This was terrorism as theatre. And we have seen that reality play out in that countless far-right extremist terrorists and would-be terrorists all around the world have attempted to carry out the legacy of the Christchurch terrorist as this ideology has morphed and spread around different parts of the internet and in many ways become a more central part of how the extreme right operates, the propaganda they put out and the ideas that they spread. And that, I think, is deeply worrying. A lot of big things were happening in the ecosystems that the Christchurch terrorists were operating in that we, on the outside, it was just completely invisible to us, right? And that's the thing about virtual spaces. We don't necessarily see that there are like thousands of people organizing on a far-right forum and talking and sharing terror manuals. We don't necessarily see that 4chan, this like website set up for irony, is becoming darker and darker and getting more fixated on racism and even at times becoming terroristic. We don't really pay attention to them because they're not happening in real world spaces. But that doesn't mean that they're not necessarily real and that the impacts of them won't necessarily spill out into the real world.
I am curious to know, the title of this podcast. This is your second time doing a Secrets We Keep season. This is the first one, Nest of Traitors, where you were hunting down a Cold War spy. This one's taken a different turn, and it's called Lone Actor. Listening to it, I did get the sense that it should be Lone Actor ? Because you are posing the question. You're trying to figure out here that you weren't comfortable with the narrative that he was a lone actor. When did that discomfort start to set in for you?
I think it was really in the aftermath of the attack. There were a whole bunch of clues that started to come out that even though we had come to see him as a lone actor, this kind of crazed racist guy who'd been radicalized on the fringes of the internet, there were clues that he had been connected. And those started to spill out in the months and years after the attack. And so what I wanted to do was sort of bring them all together and work out what was missing. And I can say kind of unequivocally that the lone actor narrative doesn't fit. He was, in fact, operationally alone in the sense that he didn't have guidance. There wasn't a guy in the bushes. It's not that kind of story. It's not that kind of conspiracy. But certainly he was part of something that was much bigger than himself.
In the series, you don't talk to him directly, but how close do you get to him and people who knew him?
I think the problem is that with needing to engage with him or not is that he's basically said enough. Part of the lone actor narrative came directly from what he'd put into his manifesto, which he had said that he'd been radicalized while he was traveling in Western Europe in 2017 because he'd observed Islamic terrorism taking place and an influx of migrants into France. And that was a lie. He had completely made that up. The truth is that he was radicalized on extremist ecosystems online about 3 years before that point in time. He'd left enough traps, he'd set up enough of a narrative around himself, and now was actually the time to sort of put his perspective outside the space and actually just try to work out, what's the truth here and where was he actually radicalized? Where did these things actually take place? In terms of understanding, like getting close to him, I mean, I spoke to people he went to school with. I spent time in Grafton. I spoke to his sister. But there was very much the impression that his radicalization had happened later in life. It didn't happen in Grafton.
Joey Watson, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks so much, Chris. Cheers.
That was listener investigative journalist Joey Watson speaking with me there, and his 6-part series is out now for free on the Listener app. Just search Secrets We Keep Lone Actor. That is it for this episode of The Briefing. We'll be back in your feeds this afternoon, and of course Tara and I will be back in your feeds tomorrow morning for another dose of headlines and an interesting deep dive. I'm Chris Spyrou. Catch you then.
Listener.